Good afternoon. My name is Jocelyne Cesari. I am a research associate here at the Berkley Center, working on question of Islam and world politics. And it's a big pleasure to welcome my colleague and friend, Jonathan Fox, who is a professor of politics at Bar-Ilan University. So he came specially from Israel to talk to us about his most recent research. Just to give you a little background, his specialty is religion and politics. He addresses it from a quantitative but also qualitative perspective. And his contribution to the field of religion and politics has been the accumulation of very important data about the relationship between states and religion across all countries?
Pretty much.
Yes.
I'll cover that in the talk.
Yeah. And so this database has already produced not only several articles, but also a book published by Cambridge University Press in 2008. And he will today present his new set of data that will also be published pretty soon. And so the title of his talk is also related to this book project based on this new round of what's called RAS, Religion and State project. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's always wonderful to come back to the U.S. for a little while and find out what cold weather is like. You don't expect it in D.C., but I'm from Chicago. I can take it. The name of this talk is Political Secularism, Religion in the State, and that's the title, the tentative title of the book that will hopefully be coming out with Cambridge. Unless they change the title again, then it will be a different title. I'm going to talk a bit about secularization theory as a failed paradigm and how I think we can deal with it as a failed paradigm, actually perhaps save parts of the paradigm and use it for something completely the opposite of what the original creators of the paradigm would have wanted me to do with it. So my saving the theory is not going to make certain people happy. But secularization theory is the prediction that religion is in decline as an influence in politics and society. To what extent is it in decline? It depends who you ask in the literature. Some people say it will disappear altogether. Other people talk about it moving from the public sphere to the private sphere. Other people talk about religion just becoming less important or less common, but it will not disappear. What aspect of religion will decline? It also, again, depends on who you ask. Some people focus on individual religiosity, how religious people are. Some people, everybody else would be talking about religion in the public sphere, either in government, politics outside the government, such as political discord, or the public influence of religious leaders and institutions, perhaps religion in society. But this talk is going to be focusing on religion and government. That's just the focus of my research. It doesn't mean these other aspects are not important, but I believe I've bitten off about as much as I can chew with just religion and government, so I'll try and stick with that. Now, just to give you an idea of how important this paradigm was, I've taken a few quotes from back in the heyday of the theory from the 60s and 70s of what people were saying, and these are mainstream academics on religion. Anthony Wallace, in the most used textbook on sociology at the time, the evolutionary future of religion is extinction. Belief in supernatural powers is doomed to die out all over the world. Peter Berger, another very prominent sociologist. In the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. I know it's a popular quote we use to emphasize these things, but there really are no shortage of quotes. Now, why did they believe this? I'm going to go over this quickly because they told me to keep my talk down to 45 minutes, but there are a number of factors involved in modernity, such as urbanization, mass literacy and education, science and technology, rationalism, the growing power of the modern state, increased wealth and prosperity, and population mobility, which all undermine or are believed to undermine traditional religion. I could really talk about each of these for 10 or 15 minutes, but I won't do that today. But there's a very large literature on that, and when the book comes out, I do elaborate on all of these. And they all predicted religion would go away and these factors would undermine religion. But we live today in the 21st century, and there are no small groups of religious people huddled together in a great secular sea. I would say there's a bit more religion than Peter Berger and Anthony Wells predicted. So what happened? Because the factors that they listed, let's just go back to these factors. Where's the back button? Next, previous, okay. These factors all exist, and these factors are a challenge to religion. They do present a challenge to religion in the modern era. So what is happening? I think these factors are there, and I think these factors do challenge religion in the manner that was expected by secularization theorists. But I think they made a mistake, and I'm going to discuss that mistake. I think that they argued religion would inevitably go away, and they didn't take into account religion might not inevitably go away. It might evolve, and it might respond. So, but these factors did exist, and they do exist, and they created they caused what I call political secularism. Not just political secularism, but since I'm trying to restrict myself to religion and government, I'm going to restrict my talk to political secularism. And political secularism is an ideology or set of beliefs which advocates that religion ought to be separate from all or some aspects of politics and or public life. Political secularists, people who believe in this ideology, and you can be personally religious and still be a political secularist, compete with religious actors to control or influence the state. No state in the world, no matter how strongly it supports religion, say for instance Saudi Arabia, lacks people who think it is insufficiently religious. And no state, no matter how secular, lacks people who think it isn't secular enough. So this competition between political secularists and religious actors to influence state policy in the direction that they desire is what I call the religious secular competition perspective. And from this perspective, all of secularization theory's predictions are correct, and that these modern phenomena do challenge religion. But there's one thing that's different. I'm not talking about religion's inevitable demise. I'm talking about a competition between two political camps. They're not just political camps, but for the purposes of this talk, I'll treat them as such because it makes things much less complicated to analyze. So political secularism challenges religion, but it has not defeated it. Whether it will defeat religion in the future or religion will defeat secularism, that's an excellent question. I do not have a good answer, but I can talk about what's been happening. Now, I just want to point out, it's an interesting side point, that a lot of people are beginning to argue the reason secularization theory was so dominant is because political secularism was very dominant in academia. And I have a bunch of really fun quotes about that. The first one from Craig Calhoun, that Enlightenment theorists did not so much as report on social reality as seek to construct a new reality in which religion would be outside the frame of the public sphere. I could taken any of a dozen quotes of people saying academics believed in secularization theory because they wanted religion to go away and they didn't really check their facts. The second quote, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's a great quote from R. Scott Appleby on how when he was trying to get funded for his fundamentalism project, which was one of the groundbreaking projects on religious fundamentalism in the 1990s, that he was getting it from I think it was the American Academy of Sciences, and he received comments like at the end of this quote, if we are giving this much money to the study of religion, then the project should help to wipe it off the face of the earth. Some more quotes here, but I'm not going to get into them for time constraints, and I'm going to move into the actual analysis that I do in the book. Now, It's based around the Religion and State Project, and I have two general goals. One is to provide an accurate description of government religion policies worldwide. That's a huge goal in and of itself because people make a lot of assumptions about what governments are doing, and many of those assumptions are very incorrect. I've talked to people who are experts on a particular country, and with what I do, I know a little bit about every country, just enough to get me into trouble, and I say something, they go, it's not true, then I pull out my list of things they do that I've collected. It's like, okay, they do that, and they're like, I never thought about it that way. People are not looking very closely at what governments are doing with regard to religion. And once I have that information, I would like to examine how it influences other important political factors and social factors and economic factors, as well as how government religion policy is influenced by them. It's a dynamic relationship, and I'll get into that a little bit at the end of the talk. Okay, there we go. The project includes 177 countries. That is every country in the world with a population of 250,000 people or more. A few smaller countries. I have yearly data. That means every single variable I have is coded for every year between 1990 and 2008. 151 variables on state religion policy, another 154 in religion and constitutions. I'm not even going to be talking about those 154 today, and I'm going to be talking on a very large basis on those 151. Obviously, I can't go over them one by one in a relatively short talk, but if you get the book, I do. And I managed to do it in a much less boring manner than you might think is possible. I'm going to skip the methodology section for now due to time constraints, but if anybody has any questions about how I collected this, I can talk about that in the question answer period. I'm going to look at 4 types of religion policy, and I'm going to get into each one. The first is official religion policy. The second is religious support, which is the extent to which the government supports religion. The third is the extent to which the government regulates all religions in the country, not just minority religions, all religions. They're either doing it to everybody or nobody in this category. And the final one is religious discrimination, which I define as restrictions placed on minority religions that are not placed on the majority religion. So let's start with official religion policy. I actually have about 14 or 15 categories, but I simplified them into 6 for this presentation because on PowerPoint, 14 categories gets very messy. For instance, I have 5 categories of official religions. But if you look in the world, and this is all the countries in the world, about a quarter of the countries in the world have an official religion. If you break it down by the majority religion in the country for Christian, Muslim, and that ever-popular social science category, other, it's very different. You see the Muslim majority countries, about a little bit more than half of them have official religions, and the numbers are a bit lower for everybody else. But if you include countries, there are a number of countries that don't declare an official religion, but in all other respects, they treat one religion as the official religion of the country. It gets actual benefits and treatment that are not given to other religions or acknowledgement, and that's where you get these red numbers up here. A little less than half of Christian majority countries do. It moves up to close to 2/3 for the Muslim majority states. It's still under 30% for the other countries, but that is a lot for a world that is allegedly secular, and it gets to be almost half of the world supports one religion more than the others. Now, a number of countries pick out a small number of religions, anywhere between 2 and 7 or 8, which are designated as variously historical religions of the country, traditional religions of the country, recognized religions of the country. So you have religions which are in, and everybody else is out. If you include that, we get to 2/3 of the countries in the world, about 70% of the Christian majority countries, and nearly 3/4 of the Muslim majority countries, and we're approaching half on the other countries. This is not what I would call a secular world. Now, these statistics are from 2008. The changes in this between 1990 and 2008 are not very large, so I didn't bother looking at that here. It was a little less in 1990 than it was in 2008, but not that much less. But if we had a secular world, we would expect governments to be a bit more neutral, and these are the numbers for neutral. Less than 20% of the countries in the world. And I'll tell you what, let's toss in the hostile countries. We'll say that North Korea is secular, which is an interesting question whether their leader worship is a religion or not. But let's just assume they're secular. Countries like that are secular. We still don't hit 30% of the countries in the world could, by any stretch of the imagination, be considered secular based on this meta variable. Now, just somebody might want to tell me, but hey, this isn't true of democracies. Well, I measured democracies 3 different ways. One using the Polity data set, taking their highest score, one just taking your Western democracies, and one taking the European Union. And the breakdown between the categories is very similar to the breakdown for the rest of the world. So this is not a phenomenon that has been being driven by non-democracies. Democracies resemble the rest of the world in this respect, except maybe a bit less of them are hostile to religion. Now, religious support is, I think, a much more sophisticated and useful variable because I have 51 ways a government might want to support religion. And obviously I can't go through all the 51, but I can give you some general categories. Religious precepts, laws on relationships, sex, and reproduction. 7 types of laws. This would be restrictions on abortion, restrictions on premarital sex, restrictions on homosexuals, all sorts of whether the government takes control, lets the clergy control marriage, all sorts of fun stuff like that. Restrictions on women. The reason abortion isn't in that category because banning abortions can make a man a father. It affects women more, but it does affect men. These are things that restrict only women. Restrictions on women's rights in religious courts, women being required to wear certain types of clothes, things like that. A lot of other religious precepts in there. One of the more popular ones in there is blasphemy laws. Government institutions or laws which enforce religion, religious police, a religious ministry or department in the government, things like that. 11 types of funding of religion. This can range from the government's just giving religion money, funding specific types of things, religious taxes. By the way, which religious taxes are most popular in Europe, of all parts of the world, Western Europe. Not Eastern Europe, Western Europe. You'd be surprised how many countries have an official religion tax. On my, I don't know how your paychecks work here, but in Israel, we have a paycheck. Here's your salary, taxes, national security, health tax. Yeah, we have a single payer system. And, okay, I thought that would get a laugh. Anyway, so, and then if this is not the case in Israel, but if I were in, say, perhaps Germany, religious tax. So, these are all on there. Entanglement of government and religious institutions. This is things where the lines between the government and religious institutions blur, like governments being able to pass laws, appoint members of clergy, things like that. And then obviously you still need a category for other because there's always something that doesn't fit into all of your other categories. Now here's what's happening over time. 0 is just basically the point the country was in 1990, or for certain countries which didn't exist in 1990, the first year they existed, and whether it's going up or down. The dark line is for everything combined. Everything's going up. The only thing that is dropping is restrictions on fertility, sex, and relationship, because the 2 categories that are dropping the most of all the 51 things I'm looking at is restrictions on abortion and restrictions on homosexuals. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about gay marriage. I'm talking being a homosexual or engaging in homosexual sex is explicitly illegal with real penalties. That is dropping in the world, but it's still much more common than you would think. Everything else is going up, and it's going up steadily. And if you take the average of everything, it's all gone up a bit, about 8.5%. I don't remember the exact number, but I can look it up. Now, religious regulation. This is the regulation, restriction, or control of all religions or the majority religion. I differentiate between this and religious discrimination because I think there's a big difference between Saudi Arabia restricting Christianity and North Korea restricting Christianity. The results for the Christians are pretty much the same, but the motivation behind the government and why they're doing it is very, very different, and I think it's important to distinguish this if you want to understand what's going on. Restrictions on religion's role in politics. There's 6 types. Popular ones include bans on clergy participating in politics, bans on religious places being used for political purposes, things like that. Restrictions on religious institutions themselves. These can be bans on institutions, various forms of government control of the institutions. Bans on religious practices. I have 7 types, and obviously a category for other. And sorry I forgot to mention this. All these lists are available online at the Religion and State site, as is the data. So you can look at the categories and you can play with the data, assuming you've got a statistical software program, because we really have to get it up there in Excel, but right now it's only up there in SPSS. That's also all mostly going up. The one category that's going down is in practices, and just in case I didn't forget, I have a cheat sheet to remind me what specifically was going down. The restrictions on religious practices in the entire country is actually very low to start with, so it wouldn't take much of a drop to lower it. And the one thing that is actually lowering significantly is restrictions on conscientious objectors. Everything else that is there is relatively steady or going up, but restrictions on conscientious objectors were dropping, and the rises seem very high because the baseline was relatively low to start out with. That's what happens when you do a relative chart. But I wanted the charts for all 3 categories to be of a consistent format, so that's one of the things that will happen. I'm not trying to fool anybody on anything. The final category is religious discrimination, which is, again, restrictions placed on minority religions which restrict the religion itself. I'm not talking about, say, Jews may not be bankers or something like that. We're talking restrictions on the building of synagogues if we're talking about Jews. So it's restrictions placed specifically on the minority group which are not placed on the majority. There are 9 types of religious practices. The reason there's more than for the regulation category is simply countries do more things to minorities than they do to the majority country. There's no point including a variable for something no countries do. This would be things like restrictions on the ability to observe religious festivals or the Sabbath in public, and all sorts of other stuff like that. I really got to memorize my list better, but it's hard to remember 151 variables by heart. Restrictions on religious institutions and the clergy. A popular one would be just restrictions on actually building, repairing, or maintaining places of worship, be they mosques, temples, shrines, whatever any religion happens to be doing. Restrictions on conversion and proselytizing. A number of countries ban conversion away from the majority religion, and you would be surprised how many countries, including Western countries, restrict missionaries and proselytizing in various ways, and obviously there's a category for other. Those are all going up, no exceptions. So this is all going up in the world on a close to 20% rise between 1990 and 2008 on these variables. Now, bringing this back to the religious secular competition perspective, I think I've pretty much proven religion is still important, so the whole concept of secularization theory does not work when you look at government religion policy. You can make arguments that governments are engaging in more religious practices because they hate religion, and that actually does go on more than you would think. You have government supporting religion to co-opt it and reduce its political influence rather than because they like religion, but that still means religion is an important factor. The governments don't need to co-opt a political force that is irrelevant and going away. But I want to be clear, this is not a steady and unambiguous increase, because there are countries that are becoming less involved in religion. They're just greatly outnumbered by the countries that are becoming more involved in religion. If we look at religious support, for example, about half the countries in the world did not change their policies significantly. But among those that did, 72 are supporting religion more, 20 are supporting religion less. That's a margin of better than 3.5 to 1. Same with religious regulation, almost the same ratio. A bit over half did not regulate religion more or less than they did in 1990, but 20 regulate less, 68 regulate more, and the ratio for religious discrimination, again, similar. 40% did not change their policy. There's a little bit more action in religious discrimination. And we've got a ratio of almost 4-to-1 of the countries which are increasing religious discrimination as opposed to those that are decreasing it. But there is enough movement in both directions that I think I have evidence of a competition. The secular political forces are losing this competition at the moment, but they are in the game, they are playing, and they are having their victories. So this would be sort of like, I'm from Chicago, this would be in the 1990s, the Chicago Bulls versus, I don't know, Texas or something like that. You would expect the Chicago Bulls to win, but you would not expect them to shut out the other side. If, well, we'll skip that. Now, and this is not something that is being driven by certain types of states. This table, it's a little complicated. I broke it up to state. Higher means the state increased in at least some categories and didn't decrease at all. Lower means it decreased in at least some categories and didn't increase in any of them. Unchanged means everything was unchanged, and very few countries were like that. And mixed means some things rose, some things lowered. But if you look at it, in almost every category, I broke it down by majority religion, and I broke it down by world region. A majority of the countries in the world are not too much less than a majority. The lowest we can get is 45% of Middle Eastern countries. It increased, and that still greatly outnumbers the countries where it decreased. So this ratio of countries getting more involved in religion as opposed to less involved in religion is something that is consistent across all categories I checked. I also checked it against government type and a few other things, and it was relatively consistent there too. So we're not talking about something that's being driven by a particular category of country. This is something that's happening across the world, across categories of countries, across world regions, across cultures, across religions. This is very much a worldwide phenomenon. So, bringing it back again to the religious secular competition perspective, states are heavily involved in religion, and on average are becoming more involved in religion over time, but a significant minority of religions, a significant minority of states are becoming less involved. This is exactly what I would expect to find if the religious secular competition perspective is correct. Now, I'm not going to argue that I've absolutely proven this perspective, because I think we need more evidence to absolutely prove it, but I think I've got at least enough to call, say, proof of concept and strong evidence that I might be onto something. I have very high standards, what I call absolute proof. So, but I do believe I'm onto something. I do think this is an argument that is worth considering. And I will compare it to a few alternative theories now. One of them is Charles Taylor's Secularization 3 theory. Charles Taylor, like many academics, very much wants to save secularization theory. I would argue, I've never met him personally, but based on reading, he has a very strong desire. I think he would like religion to go away. I could be wrong. I don't know the man. Oh, he doesn't want religion to go away?
He's a very religious person.
Okay. He just reads like he reads like Dawkins to me almost. It's scary. Okay. So it doesn't come out in his readings. But in any case, he argues that the conditions of belief have changed. The presence of secularism as an ideological alternative for religion constitutes secularization. Now, I'm going to agree and disagree with him. I would argue that secularization theory originally predicted religion's demise or extreme decline. And I agree with Taylor that religion has competition now. And that's pretty much my argument. I just don't think we should call it secularization. Secularization has come to mean something else. And if he were to present the same theory and call it something other than Secularization 3, I would be much more comfortable with it. I also would like to point out Rodney Stark's argument of the myth of past piety. Rodney Stark does not agree with Charles Taylor's view of the world, and he believes there have always people who are not religious. And this just really opens the question, does the fact that the people who were not religious have an ideology now, when they did not in the past, does that constitute secularization? I don't believe it does. I haven't asked Rodney Stark, but I would think he would agree with me on that one. And I have asked Roger Finke, one of his major students, and he does agree with me on that one, so I'm getting somewhere. One of these days I'll ask Rodney Stark if I ever get to meet him. So that's one way to look at it. But again, Charles Taylor and I are not that far off on the facts. I think we're just interpreting them, or perhaps even just framing them, quite a bit differently. Another one is the God's century argument, Monica Duffy-Tuff, Dan Philpott, and Tim Shaw. That talks about the long-term decline of religion until around the 1960s, followed by a resurgence, and they argue that the 21st century will be God's century. They're not the only ones who make this type of argument. Other prominent people include Mark Juergensmeyer, Jeff Haynes at London Metropolitan University, but they do, I think, take the longest time span into account when they look at it. I don't disagree with their argument, but I'm really not sure I would go so far as to call the 21st century God's century. They're basically emphasizing the return of religion, and I don't disagree with that. I'm just emphasizing that God has some competition, so I'm not really quite sure I'd want to call it God's century. But kudos on the title. I really wish I could come up with titles like that for my books. So I will certainly forgive them calling the books God's Century and the arguments God's Century, because it's a really good title, and if I thought of it first, I probably would have done it too. Another alternative theory is Anthony Gill's argument that state-religion policy is determined by the interest of politicians. He has a very good book called, I think it's The Political Origins of Religious Liberty. And he makes the argument that everything is really determined by the interest of politicians, and it really has nothing to do with anything else. Anthony Gill is a political economist, so he's very into economic type explanations, and he really explains everything with economic type explanations in just about everything he writes. And I think it's a very important perspective, and I don't think it's incompatible with my perspective, because while I've been pushing the religious secular competition perspective, I'm not going to argue it's the only thing that's influencing state religion policy. I think it's very important. I think people haven't paid enough attention to it, and I would even argue it's probably the most important influence that there is. But it isn't the only influence, and I think there's plenty of room for Anthony Gill's arguments to constitute another variable that also influences what's going on. In fact, I would argue there's a lot going on, because when I talked about the religious secular competition perspective, we're assuming that all religious people and all secular people get along with each other. By that I mean the religious with the religious and the secular with the secular. I think I can safely say there's some disagreement within the world's religious camp as to what is the correct religion, and even within single religions, what is the correct interpretation or branch of religion. So there's certainly competition within the religious camp. I've identified at least 5 or 6 major strains of political secularism out there, which have very different implications for what state policy should be towards religion. So there's certainly competition within the secular camp, and we have to take all that into account. There's also contesting definitions of what constitutes religious freedom. That really affects both camps. The interest of politicians is an issue. Something I didn't talk about much in this talk, but I do talk a lot about in the book, is how do you know when a state's really trying to support religion or control religion? Because a lot of times they engage in the same activity. In fact, the best and most effective way to control religion is to support the religious institutions, make them dependent on the state, and suddenly they will do what the state wants them to, at least up to a point. So when a state is supporting religion, how do you know what its motivations are? It's very difficult. In some cases, it's relatively clear. In other, or at least I would think it's relatively clear. I'm sure I could find somebody to argue with me in most of those cases where I think it's relatively clear. But in a lot of cases, it's very hard to sort out what's going on there, and I think that's something we have to look into more. I discussed it a lot in the book, but I didn't emphasize it here because that's not the type of thing you can really prove or disprove with data. That really gets more into crystal balls and mind reading and comparative qualitative analysis, not necessarily in that order. I don't want to put comparative qualitative analysis in the same category as mind reading and crystal balls. That wasn't my intention, but there's a certain, in this particular type of thing, you really are trying to guess at motivations, and that's a very difficult thing to do. There's also a huge difference between official religion policies, the first variable I showed you, and actual policies. There are a number of states that have official religions that don't do all that much to support it, and a number of states that don't have official religions that do a lot to support it. Take, for instance, Sudan, which officially got rid of Islam as its official religion as part of its peace settlement with the South, but they did not change their behavior in any way, and they strongly support Islam. So are they, say, less supportive of religion than, say, a number of European countries that have official religions? On the ground, not at all. But their official policies are different, at least the declared official policies, if you look at the constitutional and foundational documents. So you have to take that into account. And also, all of these policies can very possibly have non-religious, all sorts of non-religious motivations. For example, restrictions on religious minorities could be in the context of some sort of ethnic conflict where the two groups happen to belong to different religions, and restricting the minorities' religion is just one more way to get at them, and the people doing it don't really care about religion in particular. So all of that is going on, and that makes things a lot more complicated than just the secular religious competition perspective. And just to make things more fun, I have here a chart with 9 boxes and I think 15 arrows. I have to count it every once in a while to remind myself, which describes all these factors and how they relate to each other. I'm not going to go over the chart, but this is the simplest chart I can come up with that describes how state religion policy is formed, and I'm sure there's some boxes and arrows missing. So it's a very complicated topic, but I think if you go back to the secular religious competition perspective, you will have a lot of insight, at least to a large portion of what is going on. And this is my project's website. If anybody wants to look, get a list of articles based on this written by myself and others. And if anybody wants to look at the data and play with the data, it's online. Anybody can use it. Just make sure you cite me if you publish.
I have already questions. Yes, please.
We have in our Constitution, and there are, and I think it's fairly unique, with separation of church and state. Sorry. So I'm an attorney, so I'm going to address the constitutional separation of church and state, where we have created a space of neutrality, allegedly, where we're not supposed to either impinge upon or impinge upon the free exercise or impose or favor any particular religion. So would you view any incursion in either direction as being a religious incursion against secularization, or is there something substantively that you say is a violation of that principle, basically? Because and it comes up in the HHS dialogue, obviously. I mean, there's a question as to whether or not any government impingement on any religious exercise could be considered a secular overreach. You know what I mean?
Okay.
It's complicated. It's a kind of a legal question.
All right. That's a very complicated question. I'm going to start with correcting you about one fact. I'll have to double check my numbers, but there are 50 or 60 countries in the world that have clauses in their constitutions that declare separation of religion and state in a manner similar to the U.S. Constitution, and most of them use more than 9, 12 words that are in the U.S. Constitution. So it's not unique, and almost none of them actually follow what they have in their own constitutions. So, but that's just to give you the world view of this. So it's not a unique concept in the U.S. Constitution, although certainly the U.S. Constitution was the first to do that. The U.S. Constitution was a first for many things, as I'm sure constitutional scholars would tell you, and I'm not one of them. But I do have data on every constitution in the world, which means I've read the religion clauses for every for 170-something constitutions. So the U.S. Constitution is not so unique in that respect. As for what constitutes going over the line. Now, the first thing is every single country in a certain respect restricts religious freedom. Let's say, for example, I am a worshiper of the Ajic Palestinian sect. When I say Palestinian, just people who lived in that area, I'm not saying anything about today's Palestinians, a worshiper of the Baal. Part of their worship was to take their children and toss them into a idol-shaped furnace to kill them. And I wanted to do that with my firstborn child, as is my religious tradition. There's not a country on the planet that would let me do that. Technically, that is a violation of my religious freedom, but countries do not let people do that. So the question is, what is a reasonable restriction on religious freedom and what is an unreasonable restriction on religious freedom? Now, the way the data set is set up, it's set up to measure what states do. I don't make value judgments. A state does something, it doesn't do something. That's a factual question. If you want to make the factual assertion, are they violating religious freedom or are they violating secularism? The first is a little easier for me to answer because of the 30 things that I look at that are restrictions on religious practices, institutions, or clergy, I would say, yes, a state that's doing that is violating religious freedom. But that's a value judgment I'm making. Other people might think different. As far as whether that violates secularization or secularism, well, I would say the more states get involved in religion, unless it's to restrict religion, that would certainly be an indication that they're not wholly secular. If a state is trying to restrict religion, that might be the result of them being secular, and there's a certain amount of interpretation, and it would depend on the case to try and figure out the answer.
Yeah. The lady next.
Okay, so to kind of dovetail with that, in order to make sense, you got a ton of great data, but in order to accomplish any kind of solutions-based analysis, I kind of want to know how you come to your value judgments, and I'll give you a for example, like on abortion. So you want to throw that in maybe as, somehow you want to evaluate that as a religious or not religious kind of an action, right? A religious or a secular action. And in order to do that, we have to kind of categorize it. So we want to say it's a religious kind of a thing. You'd have to categorize it by saying, well, the people who are opposed to it or restrict it are doing so for religious reasons, right? Not because it's murder. Like you would say, well, we all can agree it's unreasonable to throw a newborn baby into the pit of Baal, right? But just a couple of weeks ago, a couple of days ago, some ladies in Montgomery County murdered 2 children in an exorcism. Well, I mean, do we say, I mean, like, where do we set the line? Who's making these value judgments on what's religion and what's not religion? And because basically, murder, all ethics, eventually you can trace it back to a God principle in some way, right? In some sort of Judeo-Christian or Islamic or whatever. There's some core belief amongst most of today's religions. But I'll give you another example. You have people who want to do animal sacrifices, not infant sacrifices, but animal sacrifices. In this country, that's a no way. You cannot go and start sacrificing cats and goats and that sort of stuff. You would have people after you. You might even be jailed for that. But is that an infringement on their religious rights? I mean, so how do we make sense of the data that you've collected and the value judgments you've made is where I'm going.
Okay, well, first, the abortion variable is the most controversial and problematic variable I have in the data set, and I actually have more than one. I have data, I didn't get into it here, I have a whole separate analysis in the book on abortion where I look at 9 different types of restrictions on abortions, and I get into very great detail on that. But to the question of is it religious, people can argue about that from here to tomorrow, so I decided to test the proposition with something that could test factually. I asked first, do countries that are in other respects more supportive of religion, are they more likely to restrict abortion? And do countries of different religious traditions deal with abortion differently? And the answer to both questions is yes. Countries that are otherwise generally more supportive of religion are far more likely to restrict abortion. And the patterns of restrictions of abortion are very different across religious traditions. I looked at Catholics, all Christian non-Catholics. I avoid the term Protestant because that brings up all sorts of empirical problems of with certain groups. So like say, are Anglicans Protestants or not is a whole ball of wax I do not want to get into. The sociologists get into it. I don't go near that one. Muslims and the patterns are very different across religious traditions. So I would not argue that abortion policy or those who oppose abortion are wholly driven by religion, but I have evidence that religion is a significant part of the factor. And I, in the end, decided to make sure it stays in the data set because the nice thing about this data set is if you think the abortion variable shouldn't be there, you can pop it out and run your analysis without it. It's designed specifically so you can do that. I chose to run it with. I can tell you almost all the analysis you run when you look at general religious support, you pop any one of the 51 items in or out. It makes almost no difference in the results. If you wanted to pick judiciously and pick the right ones, knowing which ones have the most influence, you have to get at least 5 or 6 combined before you start majorly changing any results, which means I have a good scale. That's a statistical test. It doesn't have anything to do with value judgments. As far as the relationship of religion to ethics, you're getting into a field in which I'm not at all an expert. There are many other people I know who can answer that question better than you, but I'm certain there are people out there who would say that they have ethics that are not related to religion. Whether that is in fact true or not, I'm not qualified to say. The issue of animal sacrifices, I can tell you that when we collected this data, we didn't just go, are we looking for this, or are we looking for that? We went and got every source we could get on a particular country. We went country by country. We're talking academic sources, full search of the LexisNexis database, which includes thousands of newspapers, human rights organizations reports, U.S. State Department reports, UN reports. The Belgian government and the Italian governments put out nice sets of reports. So does the EU. We went to all of that, and I can't remember very many instances of animal sacrifices being banned or any controversy over animal sacrifice. So in any of the reports, so I can't. It's not an issue that seems to have come up. I'm not sure what the U.S. would do because on one hand you do have animal cruelty regulations, on the other hand you have religious freedom, and that's why you have courts to decide when you have two sets of laws or principles that are in conflict which takes precedence, and that's what courts do. And I'm not an expert in court watching or guessing what the Supreme Court would do, although I have once met Alana Kagan and she seemed very nice. That's how much I know about the Supreme Court.
I would like just to follow up on the point on ethics and religion, because this is a very important point. For a long time, I would say until the early 80s and 90s, most of the social science so that we could get a very, I would say, threshold of ethics, which is no harm done to the other. Anything that involves harm, whatever it is, insulting, beating, killing, mutilating, this is not right, and this is to be punished. Okay, so the idea was not to introduce religion as an element that prohibits, but this was the threshold. Unfortunately, we are now much more in trouble because this threshold was supposed to be universal, and multiple comparison across countries and cultures. So actually that the no harm done is a very sociocentric and ethnocentric approach. So now, you know, people are in trouble because indeed the lawyer work on a certain society. So he has absorbed, or she has absorbed this, you know, right and wrong. And even though the goal is to create a general law or prohibition or permission, actually it's very much culturally oriented. So this goes beyond is it religious or not, but the religious question is in that, in the sense that, you know, there are tests like very interesting where you take people from different cultures. They will say this is right, this is wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what makes the judge work today in a very pluralistic society like America very, very challenging. And I just want to say, yeah. This gentleman had a question before, yeah.
I have one comment and a question. The comment is about Charles Taylor. I think it would be worth perhaps revisiting that issue, because I think Charles Taylor really speaks about something else. He's not really interested in politics and secularization. And I would think perhaps your conclusions support his main conclusions.
Yes, I think so too.
But that's just a comment.
Yeah.
My question is another. As I understand it, in your statistics, every country counts as one, whether it's small or huge. And it would be interesting just to hear how very big countries such as China, India, develop compared to the average, just because one would be interested in trends in the world. And the second question along the same line is the fall of the Soviet Union, which would, I guess, be quite secular in 1990. And in its wake, we have a number of countries that are probably a lot more religion regulating, or at least I'd be interested in the consequences of that, to what extent that influences the statistics.
Okay. For the size of the countries, when you do cross-country analysis, the standard in the discipline is to treat each country the same. That's pretty much what everybody does. Because what happens if you weight it by country's population, whatever's happening in China and India is pretty much the result you get. And that's not what we're looking for, because China and India combined have something like a third of the world's population. That's why we don't do it that way. China and India are very different countries, though. Their policies are very, very different. China actually, very interestingly, is a great example of a country that supports religion in order to control it. They have a white paper that came out that explicitly says they don't like religion. We wish it would go away. We believe it will go away. But for the time being, since it's here, we're going to have to find a way to deal with it. And we're going to set up these state-supported religious organizations. I think there are 5 of them, if I'm remembering correctly. There's Christian one. There might be separate ones for Catholic and Protestant. I don't remember. There's a
Catholic Church is not recognized, to my knowledge, in China.
Okay, I have all the information, but it's, I just can't memorize 177 country reports, some of which are 100 pages long. It's just not, my mind will not do that. But they basically support these organizations, but very much control them organizationally. But otherwise, you want to engage in religion in the context of these organizations, they're perfectly fine with it. If you engage in it outside of the context of these organizations, you may or may not get into big trouble, depending on where you are located, what religion you're doing, what else you're up to, or the people around you are up to, and things like that. Like, say, Muslim organizations in certain parts of the country are not bothered, but in parts of the countries that have engaged in uprisings against the government, they are bothered very heavily. India, on the other hand, does not have an official religion, but they have many who would like it to be Hinduism, and they have a very complicated relationship with Hinduism that involves a certain amount of support and a certain amount of regulation, and they have a lot of very large minority religions they have to deal with, and they have complicated relationships with them. So those are the 2 larger countries. On a statistical level, I use a population size variable whenever I run multivariate analyses. More populous countries, I have to, more often than not, it isn't important, and I'm trying to remember the direction of relationship when it is important. I'm just not remembering it offhand. But if you email me, it'll take me about 2 seconds to check. I have all the tables, I just don't remember. But it wasn't a very important variable in general.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. That was a great talk. I'm actually quite sympathetic, I think, to your overall project of wanting to critique secularization theory, but not prune it back all the way to its roots. I guess because I'm not coming from a sociological background, I have some questions about how to read the data. So I see the basic trend you're mapping as the increase in political regulation of religion.
And support.
It's political regulation and support, which I'd like to hear more about that distinction. I guess my question is twofold. First, it seems like what that indicates is that there's an increasing acknowledgement that the boundary between the religious and the secular is a site of contestation, not necessarily that one of either the political sphere or the religious sphere is winning or losing, but that it's increasingly conflicted. The second possibility I wanted to conjecture is whether this actually indicates evidence that the state, the political state, is a kind of an apparatus appropriate to rule over matters religious, which would actually be somewhat in line with traditional theories of secularization.
Okay. Whether the state is an appropriate apparatus to rule over religion or not, that's a normative question. There's no definitive answer to that. Can a state rule over religion? It sure can. That they're certainly capable of doing it. Should they do it or should they not do that? That's a normative and political question, and that sort of gets to the first part of your question, because there's a huge amount of disagreement over whether the state should be involved in religion, whether it's regulating religion, whether it's supporting religion. There's a huge argument, and the crux of my argument is in every country that argument is going on. The actual score of that particular game varies from country to country. The rules of the game may vary from country to country, but that competition is going on and people are arguing about it, and those arguments are moving policy in one direction or the other, and that's the perspective I look at it from, and it's a bit different from your perspective, and that's fine. I think more than one perspective is a good thing, but that's how I look at it, and that's what I see in the results of the data. The wonderful thing about my data is it's available to everybody, and it's designed so people can they can retest what I wanted to test, or they can test things that are completely different. They can design a test that's looking at things slightly differently. And if you look at the website, we have something like 60 or 70 articles and books that have been published using this data, and most of them were not written by me. Other people are using this data, and they're doing things with it I never imagined. They're finding things with it that I never conceived anybody would look for, and I think that's great. And if this interests you, I hope you'll do that too. And when you do, let me know so I can list your article with all the others so anybody who's interested can find it.
Yes. And then
I'm one of those sociologists who's still looking for secularization. My colleagues and I decided to look at the U.S. Congress as an example of whether or not there is a religious factor. We did a couple of things. One, we used a major book by Williams and, I forgot, it's on the religious factor in Congress. It's the first and the only book I know of that has tested carefully whether or not you can say that the majority of American in Congress, House and Senate, are religious. An overwhelming majority not only say they are religious, but they acknowledge that religion affects the way they vote. We've done two things, and I'll just very quickly say, we've created a major data set on the changing religious composition of the U.S. Congress over the last 50 years. People who are interested, that's itself one of the most dramatic things that we never anticipated, and that is the way Congress has changed and the implications of that change in terms of the two parties. The other thing we did was to use James Davison Hunter's book on culture wars. He was the first to perceive what he thought was the two different visions of the good society emerging in the U.S. One, an orthodoxy built around a transcendent God who has presented all the rules that people need, and the other, a progressive vision out of the Enlightenment, but including believers, religious believers, as well as secularists. And what we did was to attempt to test that using all the data, all roll call votes over the last 40 years. We put it into the machine. We've created a special chapter on abortion, which is definitely one of the key factors. And what we found, of course, is that we have in Congress now two different visions of the good society. One is made up of evangelicals and conservative Catholics, who very much, 8 of whom are members of the Tea Party, and has become very white and has lost its mainline Protestant group. The disappearance of the mainline Protestants from the Republican Party is an extraordinary finding. They've been replaced by conservative Catholics. On the other side, we found a progressive view in which, in fact, we decided to say that the Democratic Party's voting over the last 40 years is in the Abrahamic tradition. That is, if you know Genesis 15 or 16, where Abraham, instead of turning his back on the strangers on a hot summer day, welcomes them, bathes them, has Sarah produce a meal for them. I do go to Mass on Sunday, and I heard the damn thing, and I said, hey, that must be it. That's what our data's about. But when we ran the data, we find Jews, in the Democratic Party, we find Jews, Catholics, mainline Protestant, and black Protestants voting what, if anything, constitutes the Abrahamic tradition of not turning your back on the stranger. That's what does it. In other words, if we look at the U.S. Congress, it is anything but secular. Well, we do have 15% of the Democrats who call themselves nuns and ONESs. But they're packed in, and I would simply say that American culture is rife with the Abrahamic tradition. You don't even have to be a believer anymore, but if you're socialized in this society, it's part of who you are. It explains one part of this data. The other part is explained by, in a way, John Paul II was as much an evangelical pope as he was a pope of conservative Catholics. And I would say that, at least in the U.S., I don't find secularization alive in the U.S. Congress.
Okay, well, when you do research like I do that constitutes so many countries, you will sometimes miss good studies on particular countries, and I missed this one, although if you send me the reference, it is something I would like to look at. But one you might have missed is there's been a series of studies by Ken Wald and Elizabeth Oldmix. You're familiar with those? Okay, good. So, because he's looking at slightly different issues, but I am aware of their stuff, and they're finding stuff very similar to yours, although, as I recall, they're focusing mostly on votes regarding Israel. And how they also looked at how the religious composition of congressional districts influenced voting also, which was, I think, an interesting thing to look at. But I would agree, look, I do believe there are people in America who believe that the government is too involved in religion. I don't think you disagree with me that such people exist, and I think you will agree with me that there are people in this country who believe the government is nowhere near involved enough in religion, and I think you will agree with me that they are fighting it out in the political sphere. And so, I'm not saying that constitutes secularization or anything else, but I think America is an excellent example of the religious secular competition perspective in that respect. And I could probably say that of just about any country, except possibly North Korea, where nobody's allowed to fight anything politically, but that's a very rare exception.
Yes. Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a very quick question. This is specific to Israel. With regards to Israel, which I think we all agree is a pretty unique, has always been a unique case study, do you see any major trends in the past 20 years with regards to this competition that you have illustrated?
Data-wise, there's not been much of a shift in Israel in its actual policy. If you live in Israel, people are arguing and talking and fighting a lot about religion, but most of the stuff they're fighting about is actually not stuff that's any of the policies I'm looking at. The big issues happen to be much more societal. They have to do with the ultra-Orthodox and their role in society, their contribution to society. And these are very serious arguments, and those are shifting, but they're not the types of things that get caught in my variables because they're not exactly about restricting or supporting religion, and they're very unique to Israel. But there certainly is a very big change. I think the biggest shift in Israel is what we call the rise of the Masorati class. The Masorati is the Hebrew word for traditional, And for a long time, people would identify themselves as religious or not religious, and suddenly there's a whole group of people who are beginning to identify themselves as traditional, which means they accept their tradition, they believe in it, they just don't necessarily feel like observing all of it. And that's actually a very interesting case of, I think, actually academia influencing society, because these people have always existed and nobody knew what to do with them. So people, including my colleague Asher Cohen in my department, coined the term Masorati. Then they started asking people when they're doing polls, would you consider yourself Masorati? Then they go, well, what's Masorati? They go, yeah, I'm that. And suddenly you have this whole class that's actually beginning to identify themselves with a label that was created by academics to describe them. So this is one of those instances where the observer is influencing. It seems to be influencing what's going on. It's an interesting case, and I think that's those are the more interesting developments. But the big fight right now is really about what role the ultra-Orthodox are going to be playing in society. Are they going to get jobs and start paying taxes? Are they going to go in the army? And there's a lot of political push, but to use a very non-scientific example, I have an ultra-Orthodox brother who lives in Ramat Gan with 10, yes, I said 10 children, and they all have the exact same face. It's scary. And after the recent elections, they were a bit before Passover, and I saw them over Passover, and his oldest son had just turned 18. I was teasing him that he's going to be going to the army, and he's saying, I'll sit in jail before I go to the army, and he's not kidding. So it's going to be that's not exactly a scientific sample, but I think it may be a very accurate one, because you would not believe some of the stuff that's going on. My wife was just watching TV a few nights ago. We're sitting in Modi'in, where I live, watching TV, and she's got, like, you got to see this. And they got a film of some ultra-Orthodox rabbi yelling, "We survived the Nazis! We survived!" It's listing all the people who survived. We're going to survive Lapid too. It's going to be a very nasty fight.
Yes,
Two quick questions. Are there any national databases that take your criteria and go back prior to the 1990s? And then secondly, has anyone, any economists or anyone taken a look at your data and try and do any correlation or causation?
The answer to both questions, the first question is no, there's not. The reason I don't go back earlier than 1990 is the sources I use to get my information dry up around the early 90s, and it's very difficult. They don't exist earlier than that. And it was also a useful cutoff, because if I went back even 1 year, I would have had to deal with the whole Soviet shift thing, which somebody asked about. And it would have made things very complicated. There is a way to go back and do that, but I would have to use completely different methodology, and a rough estimate of the cost would be about $750,000 to do it. And I've gotten some large grants, but nothing like that. I would really love to do it, but I haven't found anybody to give me the money to do it. So I just can't. I would like to. I think it would be very interesting, and I have to do it only once, because you need that amount of money to go back a few years, or I could go back 100 years, and it would cost me about the same. And once it was done, it would be done, and I think it would be great. So if anybody wants to write a check, I'm happy to talk to you afterward. But I always say that nobody takes me up on it. As far as the economist thing, yes, a number of people have used my data looking at the religious economy. There was a really good master's thesis from some university in England by Sonia Wong. There were a few others. I'm not remembering the names, but the web page for my project lists every article I'm aware of that uses it. So if you just go through it and look at the titles, you'll be able to identify the articles that use the data to look at some economic stuff. But there's probably a total of that thesis and maybe another 3, 4, maybe 5 articles. If somebody wanted to do research on it, there's definitely a lot of room for it. And it's national level data that covers 19 years. So I imagine an economist who wanted to put a little time into it could find some useful things. It's just not something I personally wanted to get into. It's not my area of expertise.
Yes.
Hi, I'm interested in the relationship between democracy and secularity. And while your project doesn't directly test that relationship, it does find that the U.S. is the only state that has full SRAS, which suggests that secularity is not essential for democracy. And you kind of explicated that elsewhere. But I wanted to know what would happen if you relaxed the definition of SRAS?
What is that? What is SRAS?
Separation
Separation of religion and state. When you have word counts in articles and you say the same thing 50 times, I could cut out like 300 words that way.
So I wanted to know what would happen if you relaxed the definition, that even though absolute SRAS doesn't appear in democracy other than the U.S., maybe a minimum degree might.
Okay.
And I wondered maybe whether it would be,
Okay. You've obviously you've read one of my articles that looks at it. Could you tell me which article you looked at? Because I actually have a series of articles on that. I'd be able to better answer the question. Just tell me which journal and what year.
Separation of religion and state, but I also looked at your, I think it was the code book.
Okay. Now, which journal was that in? I remember them by journal names and years, not by titles.
Comparative political studies.
Okay, that's all right. That was one of the earliest things I looked at. I have a series of articles where I looked at since then where I actually came up with much more complicated definitions of separation of religion and state, and I had a strict standard, a medium standard, and a very loose standard in each one, and the results were basically the same. Most countries did not have separation of religion and state. I had another article where I went ahead and looked at only countries which declared that they were secular or separation of religion and state in some form of their constitutions, and not even half of them make the most lenient standard. And these standards were so loose, it's laughable calling them states that are not involved in religion, but I made them as loose as I thought I could get away with, and still you couldn't get half of countries that call themselves secular or they have separation of religion and state that actually meet the standard. So I have a series of later articles where I tested that specifically. Also, by the way, just for fun, in the new version of the data set, the variables are more sensitive, and the U.S. does not have zero. The only country that has zero is actually from 2000 and something, or maybe it was 1998, South Africa, based on the more sensitive standards.
How recent was this new data? Because I've looked at up to the 2008 data set.
If you look at the 2008 data set, the U.S. does have a few kinds of support for religion, not much, but a few, and it has one kind, very minor, of restrictions on religious minorities in the data set that goes through 2008. The article you mentioned, that's the first round of the data set, which only covered through 2002, and had about 1/3 the number of variables, and some of them were coded less sensitively.
And I've looked at whatever the recent data is on your website, and so do you mind, I'm just going to really briefly say what I looked at and get your response.
Sure.
I looked at I compared polity democracy, so 7 through 10,
Okay.
to kind of the middle portion of your 14-point scale from 0 being hostile to 14 being highly supportive.
Yeah.
And so just looking at, say, the middle portion, types 3 through 9, which would I think include
Well,
France.
9's already pretty supportive, but
France,
yeah.
and then 9 is the most supportive until you get to an official
Yeah.
religion. So 81 of the 93 democracies for which there was data for both polity and your study, 81 of 93 fell within 3 and 9, which
Okay.
seemed to me to indicate that there was some minimal relationship between secularity, a minimal threshold.
Well, there is. What I found when I looked at it is democracies do support religion, and they do restrict religious minorities, but there's a certain wall. They don't go past a certain point. Even among countries that are considered democracies, however you want to define, I defined it a bunch of different ways. They can be heavily involved in religion, but there seems to be a certain wall. They don't get beyond, say, of my 51 categories of support, you're not going to find many countries with more than 11 or 12 of them, while non-democracies can get much higher. Democracies will restrict religious minorities, but in general, the levels won't get nearly as high as they do in some non-democracies. So you have things, there seems to be basically a wall or a border or a line that they won't go past, but there's a lot that can go on before they cross that line. That would be the best way to describe it.
Yes.
You're not, I've got a big mouth.
No, we can.
Thank you. When you say support, for example, 10 items of support, you're not evaluating the importance of any of those items, right? Am I correct? For example, let me just take our tax system in this country with regard to religion. I don't know, I would consider that a powerful support. Others may not. So I guess I'm asking, you're treating all the supports equal?
Yes. I actually have a whole article. I have a 15,000 word article where I get into the issue of how do you weight the variables, and because this is a question that comes up more often than you, very often. Now, here's the thing: when most people bring up the question, they say, "Well, some things are more important than others." And then they will tell me what they think is more important than others. However, there's no agreement on what is more important than others. So I decided, let's check this systematically. I got together, I forget the number, it was about 20 colleagues who were willing to fill out. I'm like, would you tell me which ones you think are the most important and which ones you would think are the most unimportant? Of those, I gave them the list. I gave them the list and said, of these on the list, and the interesting thing was something like a third of the items on the list, at least one person said it was among the most important, and at least one person said it was among the least important. And if you take all the collective wisdom of my colleagues and use it to weight the variables and correlate it with the variable unweighted, the correlation between them is 0.999. Okay? There's no practical difference. Then, just for fun, we ran a factor analysis, which is a statistical way to weight it, and the correlations between the factor analysis and the actual variable was 0.99 something. It wasn't 9, but it was, so I've made the executive decision that I'm staying out of weighting. Please see my 15,000 word article as to why. That's how I basically write the footnote. Because it doesn't, there's no way I could weight them uncontroversially, so I would much rather stay out of that particular quagmire. However, you're certainly entitled to your opinions as which ones you consider more important. I can just tell you for a fact that there will be a number of people who will completely disagree with your opinion, and that's the crux of the problem.
Another, yes.
Could you just quickly describe some of the U.S. support and restriction on religion?
Okay. The only restriction on religion they found was very, very minor. It had to do with treatment of Wiccans in the U.S. military. It was very minor, but on the second round, it's a very, very low coding. It's a coding of 1 on this variable is practically nothing. But I decided on the second round to increase the level of sensitivity because that seemed to be a better description of what's going on, and I really wanted 0 to be 0, not to be almost 0. In the U.S., the support is mostly financial. What happened is in the second round, and the first round I focused almost exclusively on national level stuff. On the second round, I recoded everything where we allowed local governments, in the U.S. there would be state governments mostly, but sometimes city governments. If enough of a plurality of local governments were doing something, we counted it. So things like vouchers begin to come in, U.S. funding to religious charitable organizations starts coming in. I would say it's relatively low-level stuff, but it's not 0, which is basically what's happening in the U.S. What?
Like the HSA thing on birth control.
I'm not even sure what that.
Well, that was the question that I had, and I didn't even suggest there were no
Okay,
other.
first of all,
Oh,
I
sorry.
believe that happened post 2008. Am I correct?
Oh, I'm sorry, it did.
Okay,
So
for practical purposes, the last round cost me about $200,000. and I managed to get the funding. I'm now looking for funding for the next round, and I'm applying to the normal grants. But again, somebody wants to write me a check, we're happy to work something out. And basically, the amount of time it takes to collect for 1 year is not significantly different than it takes to collect for 6, 7, 8 years at a time. So I collect data in groups of 6+ years just because financial-wise, that's just the best I can do. So anything that happened after 2008, I haven't looked at in detail. But when I do the next round, things like that will come up. We'll look at it in context, and we'll make an evaluation. So that's about. You're talking about whether the federal mandated health insurance does birth control. Okay. I'd have to look into the details and how it fits with the variables to give you an answer, and that's not something I'd want to do by the seat of my pants right now. I'd want to give you a proper answer, and I can't give you one now.
Yes.
So I just wanted to, I don't know if you are aware, but there's millions and millions of dollars now that are being dispersed from the faith-based initiative office of the White House. So there's an enormous sort of overlap, incursion, whatever you call it, into church policy, whatever could be considered co-opting. I don't know if that's something post-Bush is huge.
Yeah.
But the other thing was the issue.
Very large amount of money.
You might want to ask them for money for your study because they're giving a lot of money out. But anyway,
it's very difficult for people located out of the U.S. to get U.S. funding for research.
Yeah.
It's
But anyway,
almost
I just wanted to mention, I wasn't suggesting that nobody else had any kind of church, separation clause, but ours is unique. Ours is very unique because we have to, one of the questions that is before the Supreme Court this spring, and it's a really material one, is what is considered the proper purview of an incursion. Because, for example, we would allow OSHA regulations to affect schools. Like this school has to comply with, it has to have heat in the winter, and it has to have safety in the med school, and it has to, it's supposed to be a Catholic school, but there are regulations and laws that are allowed to incur on any religious prerogative, right? Okay. Even if monks want to sit in the cold, they have to have heat in DC. It's a law, right? So OSHA laws, safety laws, those kind of laws, so her question and the issue before the Supreme Court is whether or not the Congress can properly legislate against a school's prerogative, or a parachurch organization, the school, hospital's prerogative, to not provide what someone would consider health care in the form of contraception or birth control, when the rest of the country has to have it. So the question that is material to your study is what types or classifications or categories of things that are occurring, being imposed against a religious organization or parachurch or a para-religious organization are or are not violations of non-establishment clause, basically.
Well, my data set is not set up to decide anything regarding the establishment clause. It's a list of 30 types of policies a government either has or doesn't have. Actually, on restrictions on minority religions, I don't think that would be the correct one, but for regulation of religion, there are 29 categories. Does the government do one of them or doesn't do one of them? Those are the questions I'm asking. Now, you can use that data to answer the types of questions you're asking if you're a little clever, but you don't have to be very clever, but you have to be a little clever about it. But I want to reiterate, every country is unique in that the questions and the specific issues are different. However, the general issue of how much can a government restrict or not restrict religion is an issue that courts in every democratic country with a judicial system deals with. That is not unique to the U.S. In Britain, they had a big case where they have state-supported religious schools, and there were Jewish schools, and the Jewish school did not want to accept people who were Jews for Jesus or something like that. I think it was it Jews for Jesus or conservative? I don't remember, something like that. And they used the excuse, well, his mother was not Jewish, so we don't consider him Jewish. And the state went and said, no, no, you're a state school, and you're going to have to take anybody who calls themselves Jewish, whether you like it or not. And you can agree or disagree with the decision, but courts in every democratic country get involved in that. Big case in Germany, the issue of circumcision. It came up with a Muslim, but it's certainly of interest to Jews, where a German court went and said that circumcising a child violates his rights to physical integrity, and we believe that overrides the religious right to engage in what is a very basic right for both Jews and Muslims. This caused a huge ruckus, and the German legislature passed a law basically overturning what the judge's ruling. But courts do these types of things all the time in democratic countries. The issues that America's going through now are certainly specific to America. In that case, Germany is unique, England is unique, and the US is unique. But the general issue of courts drawing the line of how far can a government go in regulating religion, because all governments regulate religion to some extent. That's not unique. That goes on everywhere. And there's examples after examples after examples in my files. I just gave you 3 that I remembered off the top of my head, but there are many, many, many more such issues all over the place.
Okay, I don't see any more hands. So thank you for your interest and attention, and thank you to our speaker. Thank you very much.